Hey, Catalyst community. We just finished an interview with Professor Christopher Lowry out of the University of Colorado, and his specialty is about the gut microbiome and how it influences our mental health, including things like depression and anxiety and PTSD. Fascinating interview. It is a longer one. It's going to be worth it. Now, this, as always, is an unedited video version of an episode that will hit the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching podcast here in a week or two, but we want to get this out to our subscribers here on the YouTube coaching channel ASAP. And of course, if you're not yet a subscriber, it's an easy way to tell us you like what we're doing. So enjoy the interview, soak it in, take a lot of notes, tons of valuable stuff in this, and let's go be a catalyst. Professor Lowry, big time privilege to have you on the show today. Thanks for joining us.
Really happy to be here. Thanks.
So before we get into the connection with mental health, let's just talk the gut biome, microbiome right now. What are we learning? What exactly is that in a basic sense for our listeners? And then we'll build off of that and how it influences other things in our lives.
Yeah, so the gut microbiome is essentially the genetic component of the gut microbiota. And the gut microbiota is all of the microorganisms that live inside our gastrointestinal tract.
And that's a good thing.
This includes, yeah, that's a good thing. And there are, of course, bacteria, which is what we think of when we think of the gut microbiome. But we also have viruses, archaea, and even small microorganisms, one-celled microorganisms that are a little bit more advanced than bacteria, for example. So it's a complex community. It's its own ecosystem. And, as humans, we essentially are striving to generate or develop a really complex, dynamic, healthy ecosystem, because a healthy gut microbiome means a healthy person. That's really the goal.
Now, some folks are listening going, wait a minute. So you're saying there's a bunch of little things in my stomach and I should be happy about that?
I should be very happy. We as humans have co-evolved with these microorganisms for hundreds of millions of years as mammals. And we've, in a sense, we've almost farmed out certain responsibilities, physiological roles to these microorganisms. And if we didn't have these microorganisms, we would be very, very unhealthy.
Interesting.
They play a critical role in ensuring that our immune systems are functioning properly, that our physiology is functioning properly. And, later in this podcast, we'll think about the idea that it's also important for a healthy brain and for our mental health.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. So I listened to your TED Talk. Folks, you need to pull this up. It's good stuff. You note that the standard measuring stick of fruits and vegetables, as we all know, is servings. It's like, are you getting your 5? Are you getting your 7? Are you getting your 9? But you say that doesn't tell the whole story. It's the variety that is as or more important than the actual number of servings. Talk us through why that matters in terms of the microbiome.
Yeah. So, when we think about ecosystems, a diverse ecosystem is a healthy ecosystem. And, a standard analogy is comparing a monoculture of wheat in a wheat field to, say, an Amazonian rainforest. And, the Amazonian rainforest essentially is self-sustaining, right? I mean, we don't have to do anything to keep the rainforest alive. We just leave it alone. But with a monoculture of wheat, we have to use herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, all kinds of chemicals, maybe fertilizer, add water. We don't water wheat fields typically, but it needs help because it's not a healthy, self-sustaining ecosystem, and it needs these kind of manipulations to remain healthy. So what we're striving for is more like the Amazonian rainforest, as opposed to a monoculture of wheat that has to be chemically sustained to be able to survive. And so when it comes to fruits and vegetables, there's been a kind of a progression of nutrition, right? We used to think of nutrition as, okay, how much carbohydrate, how much fat, how much protein, protein are we consuming? And that was our focus, right? But now once you understand that the gut microbiome is a critical part of human health, that really changes the equation, because the gut microbiome doesn't really care about how much protein, carbohydrate, and protein you're consuming. It cares about other things. And those other things, are not even like, standard vitamins and minerals that we think about that we get from plants, right, in our diet. What the gut microbiome cares about is, how many different types of microbes are we consuming? And therefore, we're learning that impacts the diversity of the gut microbiome, right? So this is somewhat unanticipated. I don't think this was expected. The American Gut Project, which was led by Rob Knight and his team, was a citizen science funded project. And essentially 10,000 people, over 10,000 people across the United States submitted their gut microbiome samples for sequencing. And when you submit your sample, you fill out this very lengthy survey. But there's one particular question on the survey that turned out to be really informative in terms of predicting the diversity of the gut microbiome. And by this, in its simplest form, I mean, how many different types of microorganisms do you have? How many different types of bacteria do you have in your own microbiome? And the question was along the lines of, in an average week, how many different plant species do you eat? And, the options are less than 5, 6 to 11, or 6 to 10, 11 to 20, and 21 to 30, or over 30. And it turns out the more different types or species of plant that individuals reported consuming in an average week, the higher the diversity of their gut microbiome. And as I said, that was kind of unexpected, but it turns out to be a very powerful predictor. And a recent paper that just came out this week showed that not only is it affecting the diversity of the number of different types of bacteria you have, but you can also look at the composition. In other words, what types of bacteria are present. And if you use the 0 to 5 group as your comparison, you can tell someone who reports eating up to 11 plants, you can tell them from someone who eats less than 5.
Is that right?
And then there's a gradation where the more plants the people are eating, the more different it is from the people that are eating 0 to 5. And that doesn't tell us whether it's healthy or not healthy. The diversity metric is, I would say, by consensus, a measure of health. The more diversity you have, the more
health in general.
In general, you are. It's the Amazonian rainforest analogy, and we know that hunter-gatherer populations like the Yanomami Amerindians in the upper Amazon basin in South America, they have the highest alpha diversity of any human population that's been studied. And if you look on if you look at the data, then people from Omaha, Nebraska, Nebraska.
I have a few friends out there.
Have the lowest in the comparison groups that were being compared. And you may ask, well, why is the diversity so important? And I'll give a couple examples, in terms of practicalities, why this might be important. And we know, for example, that about 80% of the clinically used antibiotics that we use in medicine today come from soil bacteria. So these are drugs that were basically invented by bacteria to kill other bacteria. And in a sense, bacteria have been in an arms race for much longer than humans have been around, and certainly much longer than mammals have been around. And they've developed ways of defending themselves from other bacteria. And we've capitalized on that by isolating these chemicals and using them as antibiotics. And so if you understand that and you realize that that's where antibiotics come from, that many of the bacteria in our microbiome can make these antibiotics. And the more different types of bacteria that you have, the more likely it is that you have a broad spectrum antibiotic profile that will keep pathogens from getting a foothold and taking over the ecosystem, right?
Okay.
And so that's just one example. I mean, we come up with many other kind of tangible examples of why it's important to have that diverse microbiome.
So the 30 number jumped out to me when you mentioned that in your talk and some of the things you've written. I was kind of going through, and I literally went to our refrigerator and started thinking, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I think I eat pretty healthy. It's tough. I was thinking I'm probably 20 to 25 on a good week. Any practical suggestions for folks that want to bump that up? I mean, there's some obvious ones, but can you walk us through the practical side of getting to 30? And I know 30 is not a magical number. It's just the way the survey was set up, but getting closer to that ultimate target that you've thrown out in some of your things.
Yeah, I mean, you can cheat a little bit. And one thing I did, I found myself doing before the pandemic is I would go to a local grocery store that had like a salad bar type, setup where, they had all kinds of salad ingredients.
Yeah, just all the whole spectrum.
Yeah, and for breakfast, I'd grab a few blueberries, a few blackberries, a few raspberries, some sunflower seeds and other nuts and seeds and chia seeds and, all the salad ingredients. But the key is, you only need like a couple of blueberries, right? I think it's a different way of looking at nutrition, right? Where you're more of a hunter-gatherer, right? It's not like if you're a hunter-gatherer, in our ancient evolutionary past, you're gonna come across some, massive blueberry, farm, and you're like gonna pick 20 pounds of blueberries and just have a blueberry feast. No, you might find a few small wild blueberry plants, and it's seasonal, right? And so we just didn't have blueberry farms in our ancient evolutionary past. And so hunter-gatherers, they had little bits of, the wild blueberries, and maybe the raspberries would come into season, and they'd have some of those, and they knew where to find the seeds and nuts, but they're not, not feasting on one product, right? To really have a meal, they're probably sampling small amounts of many different things.
Well, I think that's a huge point.
If you go to a salad bar like that, you can just have a couple of, a few of everything. And then at the end, you have this nice big salad at times I would count over 50 different plant species. So, as we come out of the pandemic, that's one way to kind of become a hunter-gatherer again, right? And it's all fresh and it's put out daily, and not a lot of energy expenditure
right.
in that hunter-gatherer activity, but it's something that I think mimics what we as humans would have done throughout our evolution. And, of course, in the TED Talk, I talk about another way that you can kind of guarantee that you get 30 plants.
Let's go and jump into that. That was one of my last questions, but let's jump into the 30 plant smoothie. Was that something you did on you did it for once a week, or does it last only a couple of days? What was your strategy with that? Oh, actually, let's not talk as if everybody's heard you. Basically, he gets 30 different varieties and he throws it into a smoothie, and I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, this was just something that I thought of when I saw the data, even before the data were published. It's like, as microbiome scientists, we're like, a really diverse microbiome is like the holy grail, right? It's like, gosh, that's what we all want. But how do you get that? How do you get that? And then, if the number of different plants you eat is linearly, almost linearly related to how many different plant species you eat, why not go out and eat a lot of different plants, like over 30 every day? And I mean, I was kind of going overboard. It's like, 30 a week is great, but what if I had 30 a day? That sounds even better. And I do want to take one tiny step backward, because it's really important to understand the biology between why eating different plant species impacts the diversity of the gut microbiome.
Okay.
And it comes down to this fact that plants are living organisms. They have their own microbiomes. And so just like us, if they didn't have a microbiome and a diverse microbiome, they also couldn't survive. And so inside the plant, in all, what plants have these channels that go through the stems and the leaves. Inside the plant are what are called endophytes. And you can look this up. It's an area of research in plant biology. And these are the bacteria that live inside the plant. And the example I like to use is a 3 to 4 leaf spinach plant has over 800 different types of bacteria inside the plant that you can't wash off, that when you eat the plant, you eat 800 different types of bacteria. So undoubtedly, let's say you're eating 1,000 just for simplicity's sake with each plant, and you have 30, you're eating 30,000 different strains of bacteria. And that's a lot of diversity. And some of those may be able to colonize your gut and stick around, and some maybe just pass through. But we're also learning it doesn't really, it's not essential that the bacteria stick around. They don't have to colonize the gut to affect our physiology. And we could go into why that's true, but they can impact our physiology just by passing through. And so, these endophytes are important. And if we look at plants as not just a source of fiber, a source of nutrients and vitamins and minerals, but also a source of bacteria, and that the more different types of plants you eat, the more bacteria or the more different types of bacteria you consume, then that kind of becomes the objective. And then, without having access to a salad bar, it's really hard to, I'm not going to eat 30 different plants in my fridge, right? Because, you can't.
It just doesn't last, yeah.
It spoils, right? It doesn't last. And so you're either going to have the hunter-gatherer approach where you go to the salad bar every day and you just pick a few of everything, or, being like a, modern urban American, I want something I can just pull out of the fridge, to be honest. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to go get 30 different plants and put it in a blender with six cups of water. And then I'm just going to put that in mason jars and put it in the fridge, and I'll have some every day. And I thought, when I first did that, I had never known anyone else to do that. So I was kind of experimenting on myself, really. But I put these, maybe 8-9 jars of, 1 quart jars, mason jars in the fridge, and went through the first jar. And, I take what might be the equivalent of 4 ice cubes worth.
Okay.
And put that in a bigger quart jar, and then squeeze some lemon or lime in it, for dinner, and then drink it like a shake. And I've come to love it, actually. I love the taste and the complexity.
So you're still doing it?
Yeah, I still do it every day. And I've got my last serving tonight of a batch that I think I made 2 months ago.
Okay. So it lasts. This is something you're throwing in the
that's
freezer.
The surprise. That's what I was getting at, right? Is I was totally surprised because I thought, after a week, surely I'm going to have to throw it out, right? Right. But then a month goes by and it's fine.
Just in your fridge.
You know how when you open something that's gone off, it goes poof, like that? That generally doesn't happen. And I think the reason is because it's a living ecosystem, but a very complex ecosystem. And just like in our bodies, if you have a really complex ecosystem, there's no way that a single microorganism that can overtake and overcome all the other 30,000 microorganisms that are there and outcompete them for those resources. It's a similar principle. And so I think it just doesn't ferment because there's no one organism that can really outcompete the others and proliferate in that environment.
Well, I think just the concept probably brings to folks' attention that you're talking about minuscule pieces of each one, because he's making 7 to 20, 30 servings of this out of the 30 things with 6 cups of water. So it's just a tiny bit of each of these 30.
Yeah, it's probably 10 servings per quart jar times 9. So it's almost 100 servings from one batch of 30 plants. And so this, to me, that's like the perfect combination of getting the diversity, but I only have to make it once a month or once every 2 months, right? And so my effort, it's a lot of effort, don't get me wrong.
But just a couple times a month, tops.
Yeah, once a month or once every 2 months. And then, every day you have this incredible diversity. And
you'll need to send me a picture of the refrigerator with the jars sitting there.
Yeah, I can do that.
Awesome.
I can send you pictures of my next batch.
That'd be perfect. That'd be perfect.
Let me turn the tables a little bit, and let's talk about an example of a situation where things go terribly wrong.
Okay.
Right? And the classic example in our modern environment is C. difficile infection or C. diff infection, right? Where you may know someone who's had C. diff infection, and essentially this is a bacterium that really just takes over and outcompetes other bacteria and starts to create havoc and begins to destroy your own gut lining. And this is a terrible condition. And one of the biggest risk factors for getting a C. diff infection is having a series of antibiotic treatments. And so, you may have antibiotic for a particular infection and it doesn't resolve. And so you have a second course of antibiotics and then maybe a third course of antibiotics. And by the third course, your gut microbiome has become so dysregulated and so diminished in its diversity that it's like C. diff comes along and they're like, hey, there's no competition. I'm going to make hay, right? It's like my turn.
Right.
And then you have this situation where one species, one strain totally dominates the environment. And what are people finding is the best treatment for C. difficile infection? A complete fecal microbiota transplant. So they essentially can take the fecal microbiome from a donor, a healthy donor, and then transplant that to the patient that has the infection, and it resolves the infection around 90% of the time.
Wow.
And so, here's this whole sequence, right, where you diminish the diversity with a series of different antibiotics over time. C. diff, which is often present but can't compete, can now compete and proliferate. You get the infection, affects your whole body, your cognitive function, your mood, your health. And then the best treatment that's available is to take a really complex ecosystem from someone else that's healthy and transplant it into the patient where their microbiome is compromised.
This wouldn't really be related, but it's a good spin-off of what you're talking about here. How about something like celiac, where your absorption is much less effective than it might otherwise be? Is that a factor in this, or is that completely a different conversation? Does it affect the microbiome? Do somebody with celiac, I'm asking this selfishly, all three of our kids have celiac. So is that something that person needs to be more aware of, or this is a completely different conversation?
Yeah, I think that's a question that just needs to be studied empirically. It's quite possible that this approach would be effective. But I think many people with these gut conditions have diet sensitivities, and I think it just hasn't been studied adequately. I think the prediction is that this kind of diversity approach to the diet could be really it has the potential to be really beneficial. And I after I gave the TED Talk, my coach, who was coaching the TEDx Mile High program, she produced a series of TikTok videos, and I've seen some of the comments of people that saw it and tried it themselves, and there were individuals who had self-reported difficulties, consuming vegetables and fibrous foods, and they said that these are case studies, so we need clinical trials, but they said they were able to tolerate this and that they felt better within days, within a matter of 3 or 4 days. And so I think it's just it's an empirical question. I mean, the theory behind it is really strong. If you think about the plants, all the plants that we get at the grocery store, as far as we know, these are healthy plants, right? So each and every one of those plants has a healthy microbiome. So we're relying on their health to transfer to our health. And do we know all the mechanisms? Absolutely not. Are the mechanisms complex? Definitely. But the theory behind diversity and health is really strong.
So let's transition, because a lot of folks are like, oh my gosh, I want to hear about this mental health stuff. Hey, bring us to that. Explain this connection between the microbiome and mental health. And if we want to dip our toe into anxiety and depression and some of those things too, just run with that. Let's see where it goes, because I think folks are fascinated by these possibilities.
Yeah, I think there's several levels to this question. One is more about the diet, and I'll start there, but then I'll also talk about some of our research where we can take a single strain of bacterium and improve mental health outcomes.
Wow.
Which shows the power of these bacteria. So the first thing to say about the microbiome diet and the microbiome and mental health is there's a really exciting new area of psychiatry, which is called nutritional psychiatry. And it's exciting because it's really effective. And there was a meta-analysis, and a meta-analysis is essentially a study where they look at lots of different published studies and consider them all together and do statistical analysis to see if there's any clear overriding statistical effect based on all of the published studies. And they did a meta-analysis with what they called whole dietary changes or whole dietary interventions. And essentially what they were doing is they were, in some cases, looking at people that were just from, the population, the community, who didn't technically have a clinical diagnosis of depression. But there were also studies where people did have a clinical diagnosis of depression. And they also looked at anxiety, which is important as well. And the interventions are whole dietary interventions. And of course, because there's 19 different studies, they don't all have the same dietary intervention. But when they talk about the common themes of these dietary interventions that were used, well, first of all, what did they find? They found that these whole dietary interventions decreased depressive symptoms in people that were not clinically diagnosed with depression, but may have had some depression symptoms, and also had antidepressant effects in people with a clinical diagnosis of depression. And furthermore, there was evidence for reduced symptoms of anxiety. And so then the question is, what was the dietary intervention? And if you look at all of them together, essentially you can encapsulate it by saying a Mediterranean style diet.
Sure.
Yeah. And so, in other words, reducing the intake of high-fat foods, especially trans fats, high-sugar foods, convenience foods, takeout foods, ultra-processed foods, and replacing those with fresh fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, olive oil, and occasionally fish, which is essentially a Mediterranean style diet, right? And is high in diversity. If you think about the fruits, the vegetables, the nuts, the seeds, they all have their own microbiomes. Olive oil has its own microbiome. You may not have thought of that, but olive oil comes from olives, which is a plant. It's plant-based food. And if it's not highly processed, it still has these bacteria in the olive oil.
I did not count that one.
Yeah, so count that one.
26.
There you go. And spices, thyme, rosemary, basil, those all count. Those are plants. We can come back to the idea of whether the plant has to be alive or not, or whether the bacteria has to be alive or not. I would argue that it doesn't, and we have very good reasons for saying that. But that was the theme, and the point is that just changing the diet can have antidepressant effects. How great is that? I mean,
huge.
It's
huge.
It's so important to understand. It's hard to implement, right? Because we all like takeout foods. We all like, these convenience foods, high-fat foods, high sugar foods. And one thing that's not been answered, could you get your 30 plants a day and then still have the cherry pie,
Right.
and still be fine. And I would say probably you would. The reason that the nutritional, the whole dietary intervention is probably working is because of the diversity of the dietary intake. And if you're eating, a lot of ultra processed foods, you're just not going to be hungry for 30 different plants, right? You're not going to eat those. And so what we haven't answered yet is, if you like a little bit of ultra processed foods but you still get your 30 plants a day, can that offset the negative elements? And there's a paper that I thought was really funny when I saw it, and I have no idea why they did this study, but I think it illustrates a principle, and that's why I'm bringing it up. And basically, they found that if you eat a hamburger, you have an inflammatory response. And we haven't really talked about inflammation, but inflammation is really important here, and that's really the focus of my work in the context of the relationship between diet and our gut microbiome and mental health is something called inflammation. And so they show that the hamburger induces an inflammatory response. And, we don't know all the mechanisms involved, but part of that is because hamburger contains certain types of fats that we know are inflammatory and induce inflammation. But what they showed is if you put a slice of avocado on your hamburger, then you don't have an inflammatory response to the hamburger.
No way.
Yeah. So it's like, it's not
one slice.
It's not a zero-sum game, right? It's not like,
you ruined it with the hamburger.
50% of this, 50% of that.
Right.
It's like the avocado can trump the hamburger.
Wow.
Right? And that's really cool, right? If you have the avocado, then you eliminate the negative consequences of the hamburger, right? And so I bring up that question about, can we offset, what eating our cherry pie with having 30, this 30 plant cocktail. I think it's a real possibility, right? That we can kind of have our cake and eat it too, right? Where as long as we get that diversity and we think, if that really is king and that trumps everything else, then you can maintain health by making sure you have that every day. Right?
So you made a comment in your TED Talk about it changed your life, or it was a life-changing step or something like that with this 30 per day drink. Now, you were most likely, I don't know you specifically, but most likely you were relatively healthy before that. And so this was one big step up.
Yeah.
Was that an overstatement for the purpose of TED Talk? What types of things did you notice that literally changed your life coming from being pretty healthy prior to this?
Yeah. So a few things. It wasn't just for the TED Talk. I did notice what I think are really significant changes relatively quickly. And context is important here as well. So I'm getting a bit older, and as you age, as all of us age, there's a process called inflammaging, where as we get older, we become more and more prone to inflammation. And we become more and more prone to inflammatory conditions. And, classic example is cardiovascular disease, right? We don't have cardiovascular disease when we're 20 and uber healthy. And so when I was younger, I did triathlons and, track and, was very athletic and was, very, very healthy, eating my Wyoming diet of meat and 2 veg, growing up in a Wyoming family. But as I get older, I noticed that I become more sensitive to, things like excessive carbohydrates during the day. I just get drowsy, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, my brain kind of shuts off, and really undesirable, for someone who relies on, my job as a university professor is really, based on cognitive functioning, right? And if my brain's not working, I'm I can't do my job. And so anything that impairs that functioning, I view as a negative thing. And so one thing I really noticed two things really. One is, and I still believe this to be the case, is that I need less sleep. And
You just sold me. You've sold me.
Function.
That's awesome. That's
right?
huge.
So, in fact, I don't set my alarm anymore. And, it's very predictable. I will wake up 6 hours after going to sleep at night. So
and you feel fine.
If I'm asleep at 10, then I will wake up at 4 and I'll be like, all right, time to go. And jump out of bed and feel great all day and not get tired all day. And honestly, I couldn't do that before.
Interesting. That's a big one.
Yeah. And so, my kids joke about it. They're like, get up at 4:30 and, stay up till 10:30. It's like, you're nuts. And
you're going crazy, Dad.
Yeah. There was a Calvin and Hobbes comic that, my son showed me last night, and, it's Calvin saying, parents are like not really normal, getting up at 6 and going for a run in the sleet. And, maybe you've read that one, but he thought that was very funny because, that's essentially me. I get up in the morning and run if that's what I'm into, during the winter typically. And that's all I could do during the pandemic really is run. So I was running every morning, and now I've switched to swimming, and I do it in the afternoon because I just like being outdoors.
Sure.
In the sun as well. So yeah, less sleep, and also less, at least in my self-report, better cognitive functioning during the day and sustained cognitive functioning. And I don't, I try to avoid caffeine because I don't need caffeine when I wake up. I feel great. It's like the best time of the day. And then that's sustained all day long. And I honestly don't think I ever experienced that, even when I was younger. And, to have that, to be in that situation now when I'm older, it's like, oh, wow, that's awesome.
That's huge. I think you've gotten people's attention just with that statement alone. They're like, wait, I need to rewind this and hear this part again. What? This is significant. Now, one of the other things you mentioned that all the pet lovers listening are going to love is having dogs, cats in your homes. That brings healthy bacteria in as well. Can you talk us through, because most people are like, oh man, that makes the house dirty or that, whatever. And you're saying, no, that's the good kind. Yeah.
So this is a whole different area that's also very important. And, when we think about diversity of microbial exposure, right? What we eat is one element of that. But what we often forget, and it's vastly understudied, and so we can't really be definitive about it, is what we breathe. And,
of course,
we breathe in over 1 billion bacteria every day. And then the question is, where are those bacteria coming from, right? If you're in a really sterile setting and, the only contribution to the bacteria are other human beings, maybe that's not the best and most diverse microbial environment to be breathing in. And so how do you diversify what you breathe in? Clearly having pets matters. And a really clear example of the benefit of pets is that children that grow up in a home with dogs the first 2 years of life have a lower risk of allergic asthma later on in life. So having a pet protects you against allergic asthma. And, those kinds of observations. And so also being exposed to nature, right, can expose you to a more diverse microbial environment. And here we're talking about healthy ecosystems like a park or a forest, a nearby forest, or a grassland that's maybe near your house, right? That's away from the asphalt, and the urban environment where you can find a diverse ecosystem again. Think back to the ecosystem analogy. And so when you're thinking about being exposed to a diverse microbial environment that you can breathe in, you can enhance the diversity of your own home by having a pet, right? Because the pet has its own microbiome. It's very different from ours. They tend to go outside. They bring dirt back in. Dirt's great. We love dirt. Soil's great. They all those footprints you see, after rain, and
yes,
you have a white carpet. You're
house.
like, damn cat, damn dog. It's like, not again. But all that kind of dirt, that's great for us, right? That's more diversity. And this is all tied in with something called the hygiene hypothesis, which my esteemed colleague from University College London, Graham Rook, kind of rebranded as the old friends hypothesis. It's also been referred to as the biodiversity hypothesis by researchers in Finland. And it all comes down to this idea that as humans have moved into urban environments, we've lost contact with the diverse microbial environments that we encountered in our evolutionary past. And we can restore that to some extent by re-engaging with nature. In fact, Finland developed a program with this basic understanding that was run from 2008 to 2018. It was called the Finnish Allergy Program, 2008 to 2018. And essentially, they decided that they were going to implement a program over 10 years to try to reduce the incidence of allergy and the economic cost of allergy to the country, and improve the quality of life of their citizens by introducing this concept of healthy allergy. And as opposed to avoiding exposure to the nature, natural environment and different foods and dogs and cats and all these sources of incredible diversity, instead of avoiding that and isolating yourself, creating this idea of healthy allergy, meaning, yes, you have an allergy, but that doesn't mean you can't go out and enjoy life, right? And engage with your environment in a way that is going to enhance the diversity of your microbiome. And you know what? It worked. The program worked on a national level.
Wow.
To reduce the incidence and the cost of allergies
at all ages. We're not just talking infants, 2-year-olds. Like, this was influencing
infants,
a 30-year-old, a 50-year-old, etc.
A lifespan.
Interesting.
Lifespan project.
Huh.
And that approach worked. And a big part of that was Nature's Step, getting re-engaging with nature. And the Finns have done a fantastic job of exploring these ideas, and these are very difficult ideas to study.
Talk about variables.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And so, just to take a step back, the last 20 years of my research have been studied on one strain of a bacterium isolated from the soil.
Wow.
Right? One strain, and 20 years of research. And we published a study in 2007 when I was still at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. And we had basically immunized mice with this bacterium. And then we wanted to know, how do the lungs, and initially we put the bacterium into the lungs because it's in the soil, you breathe it in, and that's how we get exposed.
Okay.
And when we did that, we saw that in the brain, it activated a very small group of serotonin neurons in the brain, and very strongly. And what captured our imagination was those were the serotonin neurons, because we were like serotoninologists and we knew a lot about serotonin. Those were the neurons that we thought were antidepressant serotonin neurons. They projected areas of the brain like the hippocampus involved in cognitive function, anxiety and fear, and also the prefrontal cortex involved in affective and cognitive function. And so we predicted, surely we should also be able to document antidepressant-like behavioral effects. And so we did experiments to test that, and that's what we found. So just exposing the mice to these bacteria had these antidepressant behavioral effects, had neurochemical effects that we were able to measure. There were neurochemical changes in the cortex that were identical to what you would see if you got an antidepressant drug. And then we published that in 2007. And, that was kind of before the whole gut microbiome explosion, right? And we had a press release, and it happened to be on April Fool's Day, the press release. And, so people are calling and like, is this an April Fool's joke? You inject a bacterium, you get antidepressant effects, and activate serotonin neurons in the brain. And we're like, no, it's not a April Fool's joke. And the next day, I think I had 14 live radio interviews.
Wow.
BBC Ireland and BBC UK, and went to the Bristol studios, the BBC studios, and the Guardian. Had a piece, and the Economist ended up having a piece called Good Bacteria, Bad Bacteria. And so it really captured the public imagination, and within months there were like 500,000 hits on Google, this idea that bacteria could be antidepressant, especially bacteria from the soil. And then people are thinking, what about gardening? What about mountain biking? What about hiking?
Yeah.
And being outdoors. And we're like, well, theoretically, yes, that should work.
We don't know. But
we don't know. And we haven't done that experiment. But now they have. It's like, the researchers in Finland have, and they just published. I just think this is such a monumental study and a milestone in our understanding of this particular question of, can you engage with complex environmental, ecosystems, nature, and improve outcomes. And what they did was very clever. They brought basically the forest floor.
Real quick, who was the lead author on this one? Do you know off the top of your head?
Yeah, Aki Sinkkanen is the senior author.
Can you spell it?
Yeah.
Sorry. I know people are going to want to look this one up.
Yeah. I definitely have to. I'm not good with.
You can just shoot it over to me if you want. That'd be fine.
Sinkkanen. I think it's Sinkkonen, but that might be slightly off. I've met him. He's just he's top-notch researcher. They have an amazing team. And this was the human study. So they brought essentially a healthy forest floor into a daycare center.
Wow.
My kids' daycare center had this like big outdoor area with, dirt.
Sure.
Dirt and, a few trees. We helped plant a tree there one day. But they just brought this forest floor in, and they encouraged the kids to play with it and, handle it, and over a period of a month. And, the control was a daycare center that didn't have this intervention, just had the normal outdoor play area. And they found that just being exposed to this, forest floor material that was kind of trucked in, altered the microbiome of the children.
Wow.
And most importantly, when they were able to take a blood sample from the children, and my kids hate needles, so I don't know how they did this, but they got a blood sample from the children, and they measured these immune molecules that we know are really critical for keeping inflammation under control. And they're called interleukin 10, and the exact molecules aren't important, but one's interleukin 10 and the other is TGF beta, transforming growth factor beta. And we knew, and to show how all this ties in together, we knew that the bacterium that I studied, which I haven't even mentioned its name, is called Mycobacterium vaccae. We knew that Mycobacterium vaccae can prevent allergic airway inflammation in mouse models. And we knew that protection from inflammation depends on those same two molecules, interleukin 10 and TGF beta. So we knew that the soil bacterium could increase interleukin 10, increase TGF beta, and it could prevent allergic airway inflammation in models of allergic asthma.
Wow.
And now in children, they bring in this forest floor, which has lots of soil, right? Soil bacteria. Kids play with it. And then after a month, they have more TGF beta and interleukin 10 in their blood. And it's like, wow, it really does work.
Wow.
And if you have more IL-10, you have more TGF beta, you have more protection from allergic airway inflammation, allergic asthma, and we think psychiatric disorders later on in life. And so why do I say that? It's because it's becoming very clear that inflammation is a risk factor, not just for what we typically consider to be inflammatory conditions like allergic asthma, cardiovascular disease, type 1 diabetes, Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, etc., but also psychiatric disorders. And this became clear most clear early on with depression. And that's very well established. You can actually cause depression by giving one of these inflammatory immune molecules to humans. And then the patients become depressed after getting the treatment.
Wow.
And so we've known that for a long time with depression, and now it's clear with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And an early indication of that, and I think this is really important to kind of understand, and why it's so clear now that it's a risk factor. There was a study of 2,600 U.S. Marines, and they took blood samples at boot camp, and they measured this biomarker of inflammation, which is called C-reactive protein, or CRP. And you can actually have CRP measured at your family doctor's office. I sometimes request a CRP assessment in my annual health assessment. And the American Heart Association has developed these thresholds for CRP concentration. So if you have below 1.0 milligram per liter, then you have no risk of cardiovascular disease. If you have between 1 and 3, you have moderate risk for cardiovascular disease. And if you have above 3, you have high risk of cardiovascular disease. So here's a clinical cutoff for risk of developing inflammatory disease. And what they found in these U.S. Marines is individuals who had higher CRP when they were at boot camp were at much higher risk of developing PTSD symptoms after deployment overseas.
Wow.
3 to 6 months after being deployed. So if individuals came into boot camp and they just had higher inflammatory markers, those were the individuals that went on to develop PTSD later on.
Wow.
Another more recent study, it was just published this year actually, they looked at the 101st Airborne Rangers in Kentucky, very elite force, and they did the same thing. But not only did they measure CRP, but they measured lots of other blood biomarkers. They did lots of surveys, asked about sleep quality and anxiety symptoms and other clinical symptoms, etc. And then they were deployed to Afghanistan specifically. And then again, 3 to 6 months after deployment, they brought them back and they assessed for PTSD symptoms. And then they can use this new technique called machine learning to take all those hundreds and hundreds of features that they measured at boot camp and say, which of those features predicts PTSD symptoms and PTSD severity after deployment. And among the highest ranking features were multiple, not just one, but multiple biomarkers of inflammation. And that included C-reactive protein, which had been shown before, but also the absolute number of monocytes. So monocytes are a type of immune cell that's released from the bone marrow, circulates through the blood. And importantly, we think this is important, those monocytes traffic to the brain. And if they have an inflammatory phenotype, they can induce inflammation in the brain. And we think the downstream consequences of PTSD and depression and other psychiatric disorders. Wow. So the more these monocytes, absolute numbers, were able to predict who went on to develop PTSD. And the final, there were more markers. Another one was eicosanoids, which are inflammatory lipids. And so you can see that, it's not one inflammatory
right. It's
marker.
the diversity you've been talking about.
The diversity of inflammatory markers or diverse inflammatory processes. And that's why the microbiome is such a good target, right? Because we can give someone a COX-2 inhibitor, right? This is a drug that will block the enzyme that produces these inflammatory lipids, the eicosanoids, right? It's a very good anti-inflammatory drug, but it's not preventing the increase in interleukin-1 beta and the increase in TNF-alpha and the increase in, these monocytes and these inflammatory monocytes and all of their products, right? So inflammation is a very complex cellular mediated process. And when you use a drug like a COX-2 inhibitor, it's inhibiting one enzyme that may produce one class of inflammatory agents, and it's not doing anything to the other agents. And so, but the gut microbiome seems to be able to influence inflammation across the board. It's multi-targeted, in other words, and that's what's so exciting about it.
And I'm watching the time, and you've been so generous. I've got one more question folks are, I'm sure, begging me to ask, and it's not, I'm not intending this as a fix-all, but is there any indication that the probiotics and prebiotics that are so popular now have any influence? A lot, obviously, the best option are the things you've been talking us through, but is there anything out there recently showing us that, yeah, it's not the thing, you've got a lot better options, but it could be helpful, or do we just not know with either the pre or the pro?
Yeah, so two things. Prebiotics, probably a great idea, because prebiotics are essentially food for the gut microbiome. Prebiotics are complex fibers that are found in plants that human cells cannot metabolize, but bacteria can. And it turns out that it's the good bacteria that can metabolize these prebiotics. And so when you eat fiber, and this could be fiber in plant, fruits and vegetables as part of your normal diet, again, the 30 plants thing, or you can take a fiber supplement like psyllium flakes or other types of fiber, right? That can be used as food for the bacteria. And then you can allow expansion of these bacteria that have beneficial effects. So that's kind of still a broad spectrum approach. When you get to the single probiotic, it's much more targeted. And here it may be that probiotics may be more effective in individuals that we already know have elevated inflammation, right? So we actually conducted a clinical trial in U.S. veterans with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And this was done together with Lisa Brenner at the VA in Denver and her team. And we used a particular probiotic that we knew had anti-inflammatory effects. And there was evidence that it also had immunoregulatory effects, which can be beneficial. And we again looked at CRP because we know that CRP is this risk factor. And what we found is when we gave the probiotic for 8 weeks, and we compared CRP at the beginning of the trial with CRP at the end of the trial, we saw reductions in individuals that got the probiotic, but with a p-value of 0.056, which is, not technically significant,
right,
but it's a bit of splitting hairs, at that point.
Right.
And we're doing a new trial, and we've optimized the trial by only allowing participants that have CRP above a certain threshold. Because the problem with the first trial is we had some people who didn't have any CRP, and if you don't have any, then you can't go down.
You can't change it.
That's why we didn't see a stronger effect. We're quite sure about that. And so in that, that's evidence that a probiotic strategy can work to reduce what are known risk factors, in other words. And the other thing that we saw was we exposed participants to the most stressful thing that we can do to human beings in a clinical setting that's ethical.
I remember you talking about this.
Yeah. Have them get up and give a speech in front of a camera. And what we found is people that had the probiotic had an attenuated heart tachycardia, or increase in heart rate in response to the stressor. And we're starting to think that this is
with the probiotic. It was elevated?
When they had the probiotic, it reduced their stress-induced heart rate. So it reduced their reactivity to the stressor. And we think that this is important because, particularly in PTSD, increased arousal, which includes activation of the sympathetic nervous system, is part of the PTSD condition. It's part of the diagnostic
just don't turn off
criteria, right? And you just can't shut off that hypervigilance and arousal. And the probiotics seem to shut that off.
Interesting.
At least as measured by the stress-induced heart rate, increase in heart rate. So we're very intrigued by that. We have some preclinical studies that support that we haven't published yet, that we are really pointing us in the direction that somehow these probiotics seem to be altering the autonomic nervous system. We don't completely understand how they do that. But the thing I want, this is very important, the thing I want to caution people about is that these probiotic effects, they're very strain specific. So, for example, you can't just, if someone tells you, your cousin or, friend or family says, oh, take Lactobacillus reuteri, as a probiotic. There are dozens of strains of Lactobacillus reuteri that are available commercially and are on the market. And what we know about probiotics, particularly, some people have suggested the term psychobiotic, where a probiotic has mental health benefits. Particularly in the case of these psychobiotics, they're very strain specific. And so you can have two bacteria that are of the same species, but different strains, and one is effective and one is not. And so it's not enough to know the species name, the genus and species, Lactobacillus reuteri. You also have to know the strain designation, which is a series of letters and numbers after the species name. And so there's a tremendous need for education of the consumer. What are active strains and what are not active strains? And there is one organization that I can point people toward that is working very hard to kind of bridge that gap. And I think if you just type in like probiotic guide, you'll find it online. And what they've done is they have a section for children and they have a section for adults. And they have a series of clinical conditions like diarrhea, constipation.
That makes it specific versus just generic.
Mood,
these have billions of different. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Mood or affect, right? And they have 3 levels of evidence: 1, 2, and 3. Like, how good is the evidence for this probiotic for this condition?
Interesting.
And they have one listed for mood and affect.
Okay.
And that's based on the fact that there have been multiple clinical trials with that combination, with positive outcomes in studies that were unbiased and where they identified the strains of the probiotics that are being used.
Okay.
And they also identified the commercial products. And so that's important for the consumer, because you might buy a probiotic that is just a probiotic, right? It's just a probiotic in some kind of oil or, inert substance. Or it could be a probiotic that's packaged together with a prebiotic, right? And that combination may matter, or maybe there's 2 strains in one package, right? And that matters. And so
that
what
site will help them determine, that's the one I need to use for me.
This particular product, which you can buy at your favorite,
whatever
supplier, that product has evidence for being effective. And I think that's the level of scrutiny that's required for the probiotics. And I think there needs to be an awareness that those things matter. The company that makes it matters, because you can grow these bacteria in a multitude of different ways, right? With different culture media and different, fatty acid substrates in the culture media. And these things matter. And, what we're looking for is evidence that they work. Right? And you can only develop that evidence through clinical trials in humans. And that's what this group is trying to do. And I also have to say, I bought some probiotics online that you can only buy online. And, we've done testing, and they just don't contain what
they say.
they say they contain.
Interesting.
Right. And so I'd be very cautious. My advice to the consumer, be very cautious if you have a product and they don't list the strain designation.
Okay.
Right. If they say, oh, it contains this bacterium.
Right.
And your first question
billions
should be,
and billions of them.
Billions and billions. But your first question should be, which strain? I need to know the strain. And if they don't tell you the strain, then frankly, I wouldn't believe it. Because if you don't know the strain, you don't know the product. You know the strain. If you don't know the strain, you don't know what's in the package. Full stop.
Okay, perfect. Professor Lowry, this is fantastic. You had so much for us. Thanks for doing this. Really appreciate it. Keep it up. How can people follow you if they want to keep track of what you're doing?
I have an account on Twitter, and I beef that up a little bit.
Yeah. What's the Twitter account?
C.A. Lowry, PhD.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll provide a link to that as well.
And then the TED Talk is a great place to start.
Excellent.
Stay in touch. Feel free to contact me directly. I mean, I try to answer everything.
No, you did great. You were great with us. No, I really appreciate it. Thanks for sharing everything. Great stuff.
Thank you.